In the autumn of 1685, in the Principality of Ansbach within the Holy Roman Empire, a wolf terrorized the countryside and claimed the lives of numerous children and livestock, becoming one of the most infamous cases of lupine predation in European history. What distinguished this particular beast from countless other wolves that had plagued rural communities was not merely its ferocity or the number of its victims, estimated at 14 children and countless livestock, but the extraordinary manner in which the townspeople dealt with its capture and death, transforming a simple hunt into a macabre spectacle that would be remembered for centuries as a testament to the intersection of superstition, justice, and communal catharsis in 17th century Europe. This chronicle, drawn from contemporary accounts, administrative records, and eyewitness testimonies preserved in the archives of the Margrave's court, recounts the true events that unfolded during those terrifying months when death stalked the forests of Franconia, and how a community's desperate struggle for survival evolved into one of history's most bizarre displays of supernatural justice. The story begins in the late summer of 1685, when the first reports of unusual wolf activity began filtering into the market squares and taverns of Ansbach. The principality, nestled in the heart of what would later become Bavaria, was a prosperous region under the rule of Margrave Johann Friedrich, a territory that had weathered the devastating 30 Years' War and was now experiencing a period of relative stability and growth following the Treaty of Westphalia. The town of Ansbach itself was a thriving center of commerce and administration, its cobblestone streets lined with half-timbered houses that rose 3 and 4 stories high, their upper floors overhanging the narrow passages below like watchful sentinels. The market square, dominated by the imposing Gothic church of St. Sia, Gumbertus with its twin spires reaching toward heaven, bustled with activity as merchants hawked their wares and craftsmen plied their trades in workshops that have been passed down through generations of family ownership. The surrounding countryside presented a patchwork of cultivated fields where barley, rye, and oats grew in neat rows, meadows where cattle grazed under the watchful eyes of young shepherds, and dense forests that stretched toward the horizon in rolling waves of oak, beech, and pine. These woodlands, while providing timber essential for construction and fuel, game for the tables of both peasant and noble, and various resources crucial to the region's economy, also harbored the wolves that had been a constant threat to rural communities throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The presence of wolves was nothing new to the inhabitants of Ansbach. They had coexisted with these predators for generations, implementing various measures to protect their livestock and children, while occasionally organizing hunts to reduce their numbers when the packs became too bold or numerous. Farmers constructed sturdy stone walls around their sheepfolds. Parents instructed their children never to venture alone into the forest, and communities maintained vigilant watches during the dark months of winter when hunger drove the wolves closer to human habitation. The region's prosperity had grown steadily since the end of the Great War, with trade routes connecting Ansbach to major commercial centers like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Frankfurt, carrying goods and information across the fragmented landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. The Margrave's court attracted scholars, artists, and administrators who brought with them the latest developments in learning, governance, and culture from across Europe. Libraries filled with books on theology, natural philosophy, and law. Workshops produced fine metalwork, textiles, and wooden goods, and schools educated the children of merchants and minor nobility in Latin, mathematics, and the practical skills needed for administration and commerce. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization and progress, the old ways persisted. Peasants still made offerings at rural shrines dedicated to Saint Hubertus, patron of hunters, before venturing into the forest. Wise women brewed potions from herbs gathered under specific phases of the moon, and village elders recounted tales of supernatural creatures that dwelt in the deepest parts of the woodland. The educated classes might debate the latest theories of natural philosophy in the Margrave salon, but they still crossed themselves when passing certain groves that local tradition held to be cursed, and they paid careful attention to the warnings embedded in folktales about the dangers that lurked beyond the boundaries of cultivated land. This was the world into which the wolf would emerge, a place where rational administration and ancient superstition coexisted, where the comfort of ordered civilization stood in constant tension with the wild chaos of untamed nature, and where the line between the natural and supernatural remained fluid and permeable in the minds of even the most educated citizens. The autumn of 1685 had begun with particular promise for the people of Ansbach. The harvest had been abundant, with granaries filled to overflowing and livestock fat from summer pastures. The weather had been favorable, with warm days and cool nights that preserved the crops and provided ideal conditions for the many tasks associated with preparing for winter. Markets were busy with the exchange of surplus grain for manufactured goods, and there was a general sense of optimism about the coming year. Children played freely in the streets and fields, their laughter echoing through villages as they helped with harvest activities or simply enjoyed the final warm days before winter's approach. Parents watched them with the usual mixture of affection and concern, but without the particular anxiety that would soon grip every family in the principality. The normal rhythms of rural life continued uninterrupted. Shepherds led their flocks to distant pastures, woodcutters ventured deep into the forest to gather fuel for the coming cold, and travelers moved along the roads connecting the scattered settlements without unusual fear or caution. It was into this scene of pastoral tranquility that the first reports of unusual wolf activity began to intrude, like discordant notes in a familiar melody that would gradually overwhelm and transform the entire composition. The changes were subtle at first. A shepherd's dog found dead with wounds that seemed more vicious than necessary for a simple predatory attack. Livestock discovered, not merely killed, but apparently tormented before death. Tracks in the mud that seemed larger and more deeply impressed than those of ordinary wolves. These early signs were noted by those whose livelihoods depended on their familiarity with the natural world, but they were not yet cause for general alarm. Wolves were dangerous predators, but they were also familiar ones, and the people of Ansbach had developed effective strategies for dealing with them over the course of many generations. What they could not yet know was that the creature responsible for these disturbances was unlike any wolf they had previously encountered, and that their traditional methods of protection and retaliation would prove woefully inadequate against the terror that was about to descend upon their peaceful communities. The first direct attack occurred on a warm evening in early September, when a young shepherdess named Margaretha Stumpf was tending her family's small flock in a meadow on the outskirts of the village of Abe, just a few miles southwest of Ansbach proper. Margaretha, barely 12 years of age with blonde braids that caught the golden light of the setting sun, had been watching the sheep as they grazed in the fading twilight, their white wool appearing ghostly in the gathering dusk. The meadow where she kept her vigil was one that had been used for grazing for countless generations. A peaceful expanse of grass dotted with wildflowers and bordered by ancient oak trees that provided shade during the heat of summer days. A small stream meandered through one corner of the pasture, providing fresh water for the animals and creating a gentle murmur that often lulled the young shepherdess into a state of drowsy contentment as she sat on her favorite boulder and watched her charges. On this particular evening, Margaretha had brought with her a piece of embroidery that her mother was teaching her to complete. A sampler decorated with biblical verses and floral motifs that would serve as both a demonstration of her skill and a devotional exercise. She worked by the last light of day, her needle moving carefully through the linen fabric, while her eyes periodically swept across the meadow to check on the sheep. Unlike the typical behavior of wolves, which generally avoided human contact and rarely attacked unless cornered or defending their young, this creature showed no hesitation in approaching the girl. There was no warning growl, no preliminary stalking behavior that might have alerted Margaretha to the approaching danger. The wolf emerged from the tree line with startling speed and silence, covering the distance between the forest edge and the center of the meadow in what witnesses later estimated could have been no more than a few seconds. The animal that burst from the shadows was unlike any wolf that the people of the region had seen before. standing nearly as tall as a man at the shoulder with a coat of silver-gray fur that seemed to shimmer in the twilight. It possessed an air of intelligence and purpose that struck those who later heard descriptions of it as disturbingly unnatural. Its eyes, which several witnesses would later describe in chilling detail, held not the simple hunger of a predator seeking food, but something that resembled human calculation and malice. The wolf struck with devastating efficiency, its massive jaws clamping down on the girl's throat with a force that crushed her windpipe and severed the major blood vessels in a single terrible instant. The attack was not the desperate, clumsy assault of a starving animal, but rather the precise clinical work of a creature that understood exactly how to kill quickly and efficiently. What followed was even more disturbing than the initial attack. Rather than immediately feeding on its victim or dragging the body away to consume elsewhere, the wolf seemed to take time to examine what it had done, moving around the girl's corpse with what observers who found the scene the following morning described as deliberate consideration. 3 sheep had also been killed, but these appeared to have been dispatched almost as an afterthought, their bodies showing wounds that suggested they had been struck down while fleeing rather than being specifically targeted. Margaretha's absence was discovered when she failed to return home at the customary time just after sunset. Her father, Klaus Stumpf, no relation to the administrator who would later become central to the story, had expected her to arrive with the sheep for their nightly penning, and when neither she nor the flock appeared, he organized a search party consisting of neighbors and family members. The search began with lanterns and torches, the men calling Margaretha's name as they made their way toward the meadow where she had been pasturing the sheep. The response that greeted their calls was not the voice of a frightened but unharmed girl, but rather the sound of sheep bleating in distress from the darkness ahead. As they approached the meadow, the men could see white shapes scattered across the grass, some moving, some ominously still. The discovery of the scene struck the searchers with horror that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Margaretha's body lay in the center of the meadow, her embroidery work scattered nearby with the needle still attached to its length of colored thread. The 3 dead sheep were positioned around her in what seemed almost like a deliberate arrangement, their blood soaking into the earth and creating dark patches that appeared black in the flickering light of the torches. What disturbed the men most deeply, however, were the details that suggested this had been more than a simple predatory attack. Margaretha's clothing had been torn in patterns that seemed almost systematic, and her body had been positioned in a manner that struck several of the searchers as intentionally theatrical. The surviving sheep, huddled together at the far end of the meadow, exhibited signs of extreme terror that went well beyond their normal reaction to the presence of predators. Klaus Stumpf, upon seeing his daughter's remains, collapsed to his knees and wept with a grief so profound that it seemed to echo across the meadow and into the surrounding forest. His neighbors, hardened men who had seen death in various forms throughout their lives, found themselves equally affected by the scene before them. This was not the work of an ordinary wolf driven by hunger or territorial instincts. It was something that seemed to express a deliberate cruelty that was profoundly unnatural. The men wrapped Margaretha's body in a cloak and carried it back to the village, where the news of her death spread quickly through whispered conversations and horrified exclamations. The parish priest, Father Heinrich Brenner, was summoned immediately to provide comfort to the grieving family and to begin the process of preparing for the girl's burial. When he arrived at the Stumpf cottage and examined the body, his face grew pale with an expression that combined sorrow with what appeared to be recognition or understanding of some deeper significance in what had occurred. Father Brenner, a learned man who had studied theology at the University of Würzburg and had served parishes in various parts of Franconia, had encountered unusual deaths before and was familiar with both the natural explanations that might account for such events and the supernatural interpretations that often arose in rural communities. As he examined Margaretha's wounds and listened to the accounts of those who had found her body, he found himself troubled by details that seemed to suggest something beyond ordinary animal predation. The funeral service for young Margaretha was held 3 days later in the small stone church that served the villages of Ive and the surrounding area. The building, constructed in the 13th century and decorated with faded frescoes depicting scenes from the lives of various saints, was filled to capacity with mourners who had come not only to pay their respects to the Stump family, but also to seek comfort in the face of a tragedy that seemed to threaten the safety of every child in the community. Father Brenner's sermon on that gray September morning spoke of the eternal struggle between the forces of good and evil, drawing parallels between the wolf's attack and the biblical accounts of demons taking the form of wild beasts to torment the faithful. His words, delivered in the rhythmic cadences of formal ecclesiastical Latin, interspersed with passages in the local dialect, provided both comfort and warning to his congregation. The girl's death was not merely a random tragedy, he suggested, but part of a larger spiritual battle in which every member of the community had a role to play. The priest's interpretation of events resonated powerfully with his audience, many of whom had grown up hearing stories of supernatural creatures and demonic manifestations from their grandparents and village elders. The idea that Margaretha's death might represent something more than simple misfortune provided a framework for understanding what had happened and, more importantly, a basis for action against whatever force had been responsible. As the mourners filed out of the church after the service, their conversations reflected a mixture of grief, fear, and determination that would characterize the community's response to the growing crisis. Parents spoke in hushed tones about keeping their children closer to home, while men discussed the possibility of organizing hunting parties to track down and eliminate the creature responsible for the attack. The women whispered about protective charms and prayers that might shield their families from harm, and the elderly shared fragments of half-remembered lore about dealing with supernatural threats. What none of them could know as they walked home through the late afternoon sunlight was that Margaretha Stump's death was only the beginning of a campaign of terror that would claim many more young lives and transform their peaceful communities into landscapes of fear and superstition. The wolf that had killed the shepherdess was still alive, still hunting, and still driven by whatever malevolent intelligence had guided its attack in the meadow outside Eby. The creature's next victims would not have long to wait. Within a week of Margaretha's funeral, 2 more children had fallen victim to the creature that was beginning to be spoken of in whispered conversations throughout the region. The speed with which these subsequent attacks occurred suggested not random predation, but rather a systematic campaign against the most vulnerable members of the human community, carried out with a precision and timing that seemed to indicate supernatural intelligence. Hans Müller, an 8-year-old boy from the village of Lichtenau, became the wolf's second confirmed victim on a crisp morning in mid-September. The child had risen early to help his father gather kindling near the edge of the Rezat River Valley, a task that typically involved collecting fallen branches and dead wood from the forest floor while remaining within sight and calling distance of adult supervision. The river valley, with its steep sides covered in dense vegetation and its bottom crossed by the swift-flowing waters of the Rezat, had always been considered one of the more dangerous areas near Lichtenau due to the risk of falls and drowning. But wolf attacks had never been a significant concern in this location. Hans had been working alongside his father, Johann Müller, a carpenter whose skill with wood had earned him a modest but comfortable living and the respect of his neighbors. The boy was known throughout the village for his cheerful disposition and his eagerness to help with adult tasks, often volunteering to assist with projects that required small hands or the ability to fit into cramped spaces. On this particular morning, he had been especially enthusiastic about the kindling expedition because his father had promised to teach him to identify the different types of wood that were best suited for various purposes in carpentry. The attack occurred when Hans had wandered slightly farther from his father than usual, drawn by the sight of what appeared to be an unusually straight piece of oak that had fallen near the water's edge. Johann Müller, working with his back to the river while splitting larger branches into manageable pieces, heard his son call out with what sounded like excitement rather than alarm. When he turned to see what had captured the boy's attention, he witnessed a sight that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The wolf had emerged from the thick brush along the riverbank like a gray ghost, moving with fluid grace across the uneven ground toward where Hans stood, examining the fallen branch. The creature's approach was so silent and swift that the boy remained unaware of the danger until the massive predator was within a few feet of him. Even then, Hans's first reaction was curiosity rather than fear. He had never seen a wolf at close range and was struck by the animal's size and the unusual intelligence that seemed to shine in its pale eyes. Johann Muller's shout of warning came too late to save his son, but it did cause the wolf to pause for a moment and turn its attention toward the approaching adult. In that brief instant, the carpenter glimpsed something in the creature's expression that convinced him beyond doubt that this was no ordinary animal. The wolf's gaze held not the simple wariness that a wild predator might show when confronted by humans, but rather what appeared to be calculated evaluation, as if it were weighing the relative merits of different courses of action. The pause lasted only seconds before the wolf turned back to Hans and struck with the same devastating efficiency it had shown in its attack on Margaretha Stumpf. The boy's life ended before he could cry out or attempt to flee, and his father arrived at the river's edge to find his son's body already growing cold, while the wolf stood over its victim with what Johann would later describe as an expression of satisfaction. The confrontation between Johann Müller and the wolf became one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of the creature that would eventually emerge from the months of terror that followed. The carpenter, armed only with the hatchet he had been using to split kindling, faced the massive predator across his son's body while calculating his chances of survival and planning his response. The wolf, rather than fleeing at the approach of an armed adult as normal predators would have done, remained in position and studied the man with apparent interest. What followed was a standoff that lasted several minutes, during which both man and beast seemed to be taking each other's measure. Johann later reported that the wolf's behavior during this confrontation was unlike anything he had ever witnessed or heard described. Rather than showing the agitation or aggressive posturing typical of cornered animals, the creature remained calm and watchful, occasionally tilting its head as if considering different options or listening to sounds that were inaudible to human ears. Johann made no attempt to pursue the creature, recognizing both the futility of such action and his responsibility to care for his son's remains. The carpenter's account of the wolf's departure emphasized the deliberate, almost casual nature of its withdrawal. This was not the hasty flight of an animal that had been interrupted while feeding, but rather the composed exit of a creature that had completed its intended task and chosen to move on to other business. The third victim, Anna Weber, a 10-year-old girl from Kolmberg, disappeared 3 days after Hans Muller's death while walking home from her grandmother's cottage through a stretch of forest that connected the two halves of the village. Anna had been visiting her grandmother, Bertha Weber, every Tuesday afternoon for the past 2 years, helping the elderly woman with household tasks and learning traditional skills like spinning, weaving, and herb gathering that were considered essential parts of a young girl's education. The path between Anna's home and her grandmother's cottage was well-traveled and generally considered safe, winding through a section of forest that had been cleared of underbrush and was regularly patrolled by local woodsmen. The distance was less than half a mile, and Anna had walked it countless times without incident, often carrying messages or small gifts between the two households. On this particular Tuesday, she had stayed later than usual at her grandmother's cottage, helping to prepare preserves from the late-season fruits that grew wild in the forest, and had begun her journey home as the sun was setting behind the trees. Anna's disappearance was discovered when she failed to arrive home at the expected time, and her parents, Heinrich and Maria Weber, sent her older brother Wilhelm to check on her progress. Wilhelm found no trace of his sister on the forest path, but he did discover evidence of a struggle about halfway between the two cottages, where the soft earth showed signs of disturbance and several small personal items that Anna had been carrying were scattered among the fallen leaves. The search for Anna continued through the night and into the following day, with virtually every able-bodied person in Kolmberg participating in the effort to locate the missing girl. The searchers found additional evidence of the struggle, including torn pieces of Anna's clothing and what appeared to be wolf tracks leading deeper into the forest, but no trace of the child herself. The condition of Anna's body provided further evidence that the wolf responsible for these attacks was behaving in ways that were profoundly unnatural. Like Margaretha's stump before her, Anna appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently, but then subjected to what could only be described as ritualistic treatment. Her body had been arranged in a specific position, surrounded by objects that seemed to have been deliberately placed rather than scattered by natural processes, and marked with wounds that served no apparent predatory purpose. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Anna's personal belongings, which had been gathered together and arranged in a neat pile near her body. These items, a small wooden cross that she wore on a cord around her neck, a handkerchief embroidered by her grandmother, and a few coins that she had been saving to purchase ribbon for her hair, appeared to have been handled with care and positioned with deliberate intent. This behavior was so far removed from typical wolf predation that even the most experienced hunters among the searchers found themselves at a loss to explain what they were seeing. The discovery of Anna Weber's body marked a turning point in the community's understanding of the threat they faced. What had initially been viewed as a series of tragic but possibly coincidental attacks was now clearly revealed as the work of a single, highly dangerous predator that was deliberately targeting children and displaying behavior that challenged every assumption about normal animal psychology. The carefully arranged personal belongings, the ritualistic positioning of the bodies, and the creature's apparent lack of interest in consuming its victims suggested something far more sinister than simple predation. Each retelling of the events added new details and interpretations, some accurate and others embellished, but all contributing to a growing sense of fear and urgency that began to affect every aspect of daily life in the region. Parents throughout the area immediately implemented strict new rules for their children's activities, forbidding them from venturing beyond the immediate vicinity of their homes without adult accompaniment, and establishing systems of constant supervision that severely disrupted normal family and community routines. Children who had previously helped with agricultural tasks were suddenly confined to indoor activities, while parents took on additional burdens of work that had formerly been shared with their offspring. The economic impact of these restrictions was immediate and significant. Farms that depended on children to tend livestock in distant pastures were forced to relocate their animals to areas closer to human habitation, often resulting in overcrowding and increased competition for limited grazing resources. Families that supplemented their income through children's labor gathering herbs, collecting berries, or assisting with craft production found themselves facing financial hardships as these activities became too dangerous to continue. The psychological effects of the attacks were even more profound than their economic consequences. The death of 3 children in such a short period, under circumstances that seemed to indicate deliberate targeting and ritualistic treatment, created an atmosphere of terror that pervaded every aspect of community life. Children, sensing their parents' fear even when they were not told the full details of what had occurred, became anxious and withdrawn, afraid to play outside or engage in activities that had previously brought them joy. Religious interpretations of the attacks began to emerge as community members sought explanations that could account for the unprecedented nature of the threat they faced. Father Brenner and other clergy in the region found themselves called upon to provide guidance and comfort, but they also faced questions about the theological implications of what appeared to be a supernatural assault on innocent children. The idea that demons might take the form of wild animals to torment the faithful was well established in Christian doctrine, but the specific circumstances of these attacks seemed to suggest something even more sinister. A deliberate campaign against the young and innocent that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine protection and justice. As September drew to a close and the leaves began to change color in the forests around Ansbach, the communities of the principality found themselves transformed by fear and uncertainty. The wolf that had claimed 3 young lives was still at large, still hunting, and apparently still driven by whatever malevolent intelligence had guided its attacks. The question on everyone's mind was not whether the creature would strike again, but when and where, and whether anything could be done to stop it before more children died. The answer to that question would come sooner than anyone expected, and in a form that would challenge every assumption about the nature of the threat they faced. As the death toll mounted and fear gripped the communities surrounding Ansbach, the conversations in taverns, market squares, and village gatherings began to center on a question that seemed to grow more urgent with each passing day. What manner of creature could display such intelligence, such apparent cruelty, and such deliberate targeting of innocent children? The answer that gradually emerged from the collective memory and whispered speculations of the community would transform a straightforward case of predatory attacks into something far more complex and disturbing. The name that began to surface in these hushed conversations was that of Klaus Stumple, a man who had served as a local administrator under the previous Margrave and whose memory remained fresh in the minds of many despite his death 2 years earlier. Stumple had been a figure of particular hatred throughout his tenure in office, earning a reputation for cruelty, corruption, and what many witnesses described as an almost demonic delight in causing suffering to those under his authority. Klaus Stumple had come to his position through a combination of family connections and personal cunning rather than any particular qualification for administrative work. His uncle had served the Margrave's court in various capacities for decades, and when a position became available in the regional administration, family influence secured Klaus the appointment, despite his complete lack of experience in governmental affairs. From the beginning of his tenure, it became clear that he viewed his office not as a responsibility to serve the people, but as an opportunity to exercise power over them and to enrich himself through various forms of corruption and abuse. The administrative position that Stumple held gave him authority over tax collection, legal proceedings, and various regulatory functions that directly affected the daily lives of farmers, craftsmen, and merchants throughout the principality. These responsibilities, which in the hands of an honest and competent official could serve to maintain order and promote prosperity, became under Stumple's management tools for oppression and exploitation that caused widespread suffering and resentment. Stumple's approach to tax collection was particularly notorious for its harshness and arbitrary nature. Rather than following established procedures that took into account the economic circumstances of individual taxpayers, he imposed assessments that seemed designed primarily to maximize his own profit through the collection of penalties and fees. Farmers who experienced crop failures due to weather or disease found themselves subject to the same tax burdens as those who had enjoyed abundant harvests, while craftsmen whose businesses had suffered setbacks were required to pay levies that often exceeded their total annual income. When taxpayers proved unable to meet Stumple's demands, he showed no mercy or willingness to negotiate reasonable payment schedules. Instead, he employed the full force of his authority to seize property, livestock, and household goods, often selling these items at public auction for prices far below their actual value and pocketing a substantial portion of the proceeds. Families that had lived comfortably for generations found themselves reduced to poverty by Stumple's policies, while others were forced to abandon their homes and seek shelter with relatives or face destitution. The administrator's cruelty was not limited to financial matters, but extended to every aspect of his official duties. Legal proceedings under his authority became exercises in arbitrary judgment rather than attempts to determine truth or achieve justice. Stumple showed consistent favoritism toward wealthy merchants and landowners who offered him bribes or other forms of personal benefit, while treating common people who appeared before his tribunal with contempt and hostility that often resulted in punishments far exceeding what their alleged offenses warranted. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Stumple's apparent particular hatred for children and young people, which manifested itself in various forms of cruelty that seemed to serve no purpose beyond his own twisted satisfaction. Children who appeared as witnesses in legal proceedings were subjected to harsh questioning and intimidation that often reduced them to tears, while young people who committed minor infractions were punished with a severity that shocked even adults who had witnessed Stumple's other abuses. One incident that remained vivid in community memory involved a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Brenner, the nephew of Father Heinrich Brenner, who had been caught stealing apples from an orchard belonging to one of the local merchants. Under normal circumstances, such an offense would have resulted in a mild punishment, perhaps a few strokes with a switch or the requirement to work without pay in the orchard for several days to make amends for the theft. However, when the case came before Stumple's tribunal, the administrator ordered that the boy be publicly whipped with 20 lashes and then forced to stand in the town square for an entire day wearing a sign that described his crime. The punishment was so excessive that even the merchant who had brought the complaint expressed discomfort with its severity, but Stumple insisted on its implementation and personally supervised the whipping to ensure that it was carried out with maximum force and humiliation. The boy's suffering during this ordeal was made even worse by Stumple's behavior throughout the punishment. Rather than treating the event as an unfortunate necessity required by law and order, the administrator appeared to take genuine pleasure in the child's pain and humiliation, making comments and gestures that suggested he was enjoying the spectacle. Several witnesses later reported that Stumple's expression during the whipping resembled that of someone watching an entertaining performance rather than the face of an official reluctantly carrying out his duties. Similar incidents occurred with disturbing frequency throughout Stumple's tenure in office. Children who were brought before his tribunal for minor offenses found themselves subjected to punishments that were not only excessive but seemed specifically designed to cause maximum psychological trauma. Parents who attempted to intervene on behalf of their children or to request more lenient treatment were themselves threatened with prosecution for interfering with official proceedings. The administrator's cruelty toward children extended beyond his official duties into his personal interactions with young people throughout the community. Children who encountered Stumple on the streets or in public places reported that he would often make threatening gestures or comments that left them frightened and confused. Some parents began instructing their children to cross the street or find alternate routes when they saw the administrator approaching, treating him as a threat to be avoided rather than an authority figure to be respected. Stumple's corruption was as systematic as his cruelty, involving various schemes that diverted public funds into his private accounts while depriving the community of services and infrastructure that were essential for prosperity and safety. Tax money that should have been used to maintain roads, bridges, and public buildings instead found its way into Stumple's personal coffers, while funds designated for poor relief and other charitable purposes were similarly misappropriated. The administrator's fraudulent practices were often disguised through complex accounting procedures that made it difficult for ordinary citizens to understand exactly how they were being cheated. But the effects of his corruption were visible throughout the principality in the form of deteriorating infrastructure and inadequate public services. Roads developed potholes that went unrepaired. Bridges became unsafe due to lack of maintenance, and public buildings fell into disrepair while Stumple accumulated wealth that far exceeded what his official salary should have provided. When citizens attempted to complain about these conditions or to question how public funds were being used, they found themselves facing the full force of Stumple's authority. Complaints were dismissed without investigation. Questioners were threatened with prosecution for sedition or slander, and anyone who persisted in challenging the administrator's actions faced escalating forms of harassment and persecution that often left them worse off than before they had spoken up. The community's hatred for Klaus Stumple grew steadily throughout his years in office, fed by countless individual experiences of injustice and cruelty that created a shared sense of oppression and resentment. In the taverns and market squares where people gathered to discuss the affairs of the day, conversations inevitably turned to the latest example of Stumple's abuses and to speculation about what might be done to escape his tyrannical rule. However, the administrator's position provided him with legal protection that made it extremely difficult for his victims to seek redress through official channels. Complaints to higher authorities were typically dismissed or ignored, either because Stumple had cultivated relationships with officials at the Margrave's court, or because the complex nature of administrative law made it difficult for outsiders to understand the specific mechanisms of his corruption and abuse. The powerlessness that people felt in the face of Stumple's authority created a festering resentment that went far beyond simple dislike or disagreement. This was hatred born of genuine suffering, of families destroyed by arbitrary taxation, of children traumatized by excessive punishments, of communities deprived of essential services while their tax money lined the pockets of a corrupt official. It was the kind of deep, abiding hatred that could survive the death of its object and continue to influence events long after the immediate cause had been removed. Klaus Stumple's death in 1683 had been as mysterious and disturbing as his life had been. Cruel and corrupt, he was found dead in his private chambers on a cold morning in November, his body showing no obvious signs of violence or disease, but displaying evidence of what appeared to be extreme agitation or terror in his final moments. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the circumstances surrounding his demise gave rise to numerous theories and speculations that reflected both the community's hatred for the man and their willingness to believe that supernatural forces might have intervened to bring about his end. The administrator's chambers, when they were discovered by his servants on the morning after his death, showed signs of a violent struggle that seemed inconsistent with the theory of natural death from heart failure. Furniture had been overturned, papers were scattered across the floor, and there were scratch marks on the walls and doors that appeared to have been made by human fingernails. Most disturbing of all were the expressions of terror frozen on Stumple's face, suggesting that he had died in a state of extreme fear rather than the peaceful passing that might be expected from simple cardiac arrest. Various theories emerged to account for these strange circumstances. Some suggested that Stumple had been visited by supernatural forces as punishment for his earthly cruelties, pointing to local folklore about the fate of those who oppress the innocent and helpless. Others proposed that he had taken his own life, rather than face the consequences of his increasingly erratic behavior and mounting evidence of his corruption, though this theory failed to account for the physical signs of struggle in his chambers. A few individuals whispered about the possibility that Stumple had been murdered by someone seeking revenge for his abuses. But this theory was never seriously investigated by the authorities, who seemed eager to close the case and move on to the process of selecting a new administrator who might restore some measure of competence and honesty to local government. Whatever the true cause of Klaus Stumple's death, his passing was greeted with unconcealed relief throughout the principality. There were no mourners at his funeral beyond a few officials who were required to attend for ceremonial purposes, and no expressions of grief or loss from the communities that he had terrorized during his years in office. Instead, his death was treated as a form of liberation, an end to a nightmare of oppression that had seemed likely to continue indefinitely. However, the community's relief at Stumple's demise would prove to be premature. As the wolf attacks began to claim young victims in the autumn of 1685, approximately 2 years after the administrator's death, people began to notice disturbing parallels between the creature's behavior and the cruelties that Stumple had inflicted during his lifetime. The wolf's apparent intelligence, its deliberate targeting of children, and its ritualistic treatment of its victims all seemed to echo the administrator's own psychological patterns and behavioral preferences. The timing of the attacks also seemed significant to those who were familiar with traditional beliefs about the supernatural. Folk wisdom held that evil souls might require a period of approximately 2 years to complete their transformation and return to the earthly realm in altered form, a time frame that corresponded almost exactly with the interval between Stumple's death and the beginning of the wolf attacks. As these connections became apparent to the people of Ansbach, what had initially been understood as a straightforward case of predatory animal behavior began to take on darker implications. If the wolf was indeed the supernatural manifestation of Klaus Stumple's evil spirit, then the creature's attacks represented not random predation, but rather a continuation of the administrator's campaign of cruelty against the innocent, particularly the children who had suffered so greatly under his earthly authority. This interpretation of events provided both an explanation for the wolf's unusual behavior and a framework for understanding the broader significance of the crisis facing the community. The attacks were no longer seen as simple misfortune, but as a form of supernatural justice that required an appropriate response, one that would address both the immediate threat posed by the creature and the underlying spiritual corruption that it was believed to represent. The stage was thus set for the great hunt that would follow, as the people of Ansbach prepared to confront what they increasingly believed to be not merely a dangerous animal, but the vengeful spirit of their former tormentor, returned in bestial form to continue his reign of terror against the innocent. The Margrave's administrators took formal notice of the mounting crisis in early October, when reports of the attacks reached the court in Asbanch and demanded official response. Johann Friedrich, Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, was a ruler who had earned respect throughout the region for his competent governance and genuine concern for the welfare of his subjects. Unlike his predecessor, whose administration had allowed officials like Klaus Stumpel to operate with relative impunity, the current Margrave maintained closer oversight of local affairs and was quick to respond when circumstances threatened public safety or order. The initial response was both swift and conventional, following established procedures for dealing with dangerous predators that had been developed through centuries of experience with wolf populations throughout the Germanic territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Professional hunters and trackers were dispatched from the Margrave's court to locate and eliminate the threat. Men whose skills had been honed through years of experience in managing the complex relationship between human communities and the wild creatures that shared their landscape. The leader of this professional hunting expedition was Wolfgang Dietrich, a man whose reputation for tracking and killing dangerous animals extended far beyond the boundaries of the Ansbach Principality. Dietrich had served various noble houses throughout Franconia and Swabia, dealing with everything from rogue bears that threatened livestock to packs of wolves that had grown too bold in their approach to human settlements. His methods were systematic, efficient, and grounded in decades of practical experience with predatory behavior and hunting techniques. Dietrich arrived in Ansbach with a team of 5 experienced hunters, each bringing specialized skills and equipment that would be essential for tracking and killing a particularly dangerous predator. The group included 2 master trackers who could read sign and follow trails through the most difficult terrain, 2 expert marksmen whose accuracy with crossbow and musket had been proven in countless previous hunts, and a specialist in animal behavior who had studied the psychological patterns that drove predators to unusual or aggressive behavior. The hunting party began their work with a systematic examination of each attack site, looking for physical evidence that could provide insights into the creature's size, behavior patterns, and preferred hunting grounds. What they discovered troubled them far more than they had expected based on the initial reports they had received. The wolf tracks they found were indeed of exceptional size, but more disturbing were the behavioral patterns revealed by careful examination of the attack sites. Normal wolf predation followed predictable patterns based on the animal's natural instincts and survival needs. Wolves typically selected prey that could be easily overwhelmed, attacked in ways that minimized their own risk of injury, consumed what they needed for immediate sustenance, and then either cached the remaining meat for later consumption or abandoned it to scavengers. The evidence at the attack sites near Ansbach suggested behavior that violated virtually every one of these normal patterns. The creature had consistently selected human children rather than the livestock that would have provided easier targets and better nutrition. The attacks themselves showed evidence of unnecessary violence that served no apparent survival purpose, while the ritualistic arrangement of victims and personal belongings suggested psychological motivations that went far beyond simple predation. Most puzzling of all, there was little evidence that the wolf had consumed any significant portion of its victims, indicating that hunger was not the primary driving force behind the attacks. Dietrich and his team spent several days examining the physical evidence before beginning their active pursuit of the creature. Their tracking efforts led them through dense forests, across streams and valleys, and into remote areas where human presence was minimal and the wolf would have numerous hiding places and escape routes. The trail was often difficult to follow, not because the creature was particularly careful about concealing its tracks, but because its movement patterns seemed to lack the logical consistency that typically characterized animal behavior. Normal predators established territories with recognizable boundaries and moved through their hunting grounds in patterns that reflected the distribution of prey animals, the availability of water and shelter, and the need to avoid competing predators. The wolf they were tracking seemed to move almost randomly through the landscape, covering vast distances without apparent purpose and showing no preference for the types of terrain that would normally attract a creature of its size and hunting style. This erratic behavior made it extremely difficult for even experienced trackers to predict where the wolf might appear next, or to establish effective ambush positions where they could wait for the creature to approach within range of their weapons. Several times, the hunting party followed fresh tracks for miles, only to discover that the trail simply ended in areas where continued tracking was impossible. Rocky ground that would not hold impressions, streams that would wash away scent, or dense thickets where following the trail would require making too much noise to maintain the element of surprise. The wolf's apparent ability to evade the professional hunters began to attract attention and comment throughout the communities surrounding Ansbach. Local people who had initially placed great confidence in Dietrich's reputation and expertise began to whisper that perhaps this creature was beyond the reach of conventional hunting methods. These whispers grew louder when several experienced local woodsmen reported encounters with the wolf that seemed to demonstrate an almost supernatural awareness of human activities and intentions. Johann Fuchs, a forester who had worked in the region for more than 30 years and who knew every trail, stream, and clearing in the surrounding woodland, reported an encounter that particularly disturbed both the professional hunters and the local population. Fuchs had been checking trap lines in a remote section of forest when he spotted the wolf watching him from a distance of perhaps 50 yards. Rather than fleeing at the sight of a human, as would be normal for a wild predator, the creature had remained in position and appeared to study the forester's activities with what Fuchs described as obvious intelligence and calculation. The standoff had lasted for several minutes, during which Fuchs had remained as still as possible while trying to decide whether to attempt to retreat or to signal for help from the hunting party that was working in the area. The wolf's behavior during this time was unlike anything the experienced woodsman had ever witnessed. Rather than showing the wariness or aggressive posturing that would be expected from a cornered wild animal, the creature had appeared calm and almost contemplative, occasionally tilting its head as if considering different courses of action or listening to sounds that were inaudible to human ears. The encounter had ended when the wolf simply turned and walked away, moving with unhurried dignity into the deeper forest and disappearing from sight. Fuchs's account of this incident emphasized the deliberate, almost casual nature of the creature's departure. This was not the hasty flight of an animal that felt threatened, but rather the composed withdrawal of a being that had completed its examination of the human and chosen to move on to other business. Similar encounters were reported by other local residents who had occasion to venture into the forest during the hunting expedition. In each case, the wolf had displayed behavior that seemed to indicate awareness of human activities and intentions that went far beyond normal animal intelligence. The creature appeared to understand that it was being hunted and to take deliberate steps to avoid or confound its pursuers, while also seeming to enjoy the challenge of the chase and the opportunity to demonstrate its superiority over human efforts to capture it. These reports began to influence local interpretation of the wolf's nature and origins. If the creature was indeed the supernatural manifestation of Klaus Stumpel's evil spirit, as many people had begun to believe, then its apparent intelligence and ability to evade conventional hunting methods made perfect sense. A human consciousness, even one that had been transformed into bestial form, would naturally possess understanding of human psychology and behavior that would allow it to anticipate and counter the efforts of its pursuers. This theory gained further credence when several residents of the affected communities reported experiencing unusual dreams and phenomena that seemed connected to the wolf attacks. Maria Hoffman, the elderly widow who had suffered under Stumpel's administration, began having recurring nightmares featuring a large wolf with distinctly human eyes that spoke to her in what she recognized as the administrator's voice, taunting her about the death of innocent children and promising that the suffering she had experienced during his lifetime was nothing compared to what was yet to come. Other residents reported similar supernatural experiences. Strange sounds heard in the night that seemed to combine wolf howls with human laughter, glimpses of a large gray shape moving through their gardens or past their windows during the darkest hours before dawn, and dreams in which they were pursued through endless forests by a creature that seemed to know their names and their deepest fears. These accounts, while perhaps influenced by fear and suggestion, created a growing sense that the community was dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than a simple predatory animal. The professional hunters, despite their expertise and experience, seemed no more capable of eliminating the threat than ordinary citizens would have been. And the wolf's continuing attacks demonstrated that conventional methods were inadequate to deal with whatever force was responsible for the reign of terror. As October progressed and the death toll continued to climb, the mood in Ansbach and the surrounding communities began to shift from fear to a more complex mixture of terror and determination. The wolf had claimed 6 more young victims since the professional hunting expedition had begun, each death following the same disturbing pattern of efficient killing followed by ritualistic arrangement of the body and personal belongings. The creature seemed to be growing bolder in its attacks, striking closer to populated areas and showing less concern about the possibility of interference from adult humans. The most recent victim had been little Greta Zimmerman, a 5-year-old girl who had been playing in her family's garden just outside the walls of Ansbach itself. The proximity of this attack to the town center sent waves of panic through the urban population, who had previously felt relatively secure behind their walls and fortifications. If the wolf could strike within sight of the town gates, then no child anywhere in the principality could be considered truly safe from its depredations. The failure of conventional hunting methods to eliminate the threat, combined with the growing belief that the wolf was supernatural in origin, began to generate calls for a different kind of response, one that would acknowledge the spiritual dimensions of the crisis and mobilize the entire community in a coordinated effort to confront and defeat the evil force that was terrorizing their children. The stage was being set for the great hunt that would follow, an unprecedented mobilization of human resources and determination that would transform a simple predator control operation into something resembling a medieval crusade against the forces of darkness. The people of Ansbach were preparing to take matters into their own hands, armed not only with conventional weapons, but with prayers, holy water, and an unshakable determination to end the nightmare that had consumed their communities for far too long. By mid-November of 1685, the situation in the principality had reached a crisis point that demanded extraordinary action. The wolf had now claimed 14 confirmed victims, all children between the ages of 4 and 12, and its attacks were becoming increasingly bold and unpredictable. Professional hunters had proven unable to track down and eliminate the creature, while its apparent supernatural abilities and intelligence had convinced much of the population that they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of normal predatory behavior. The decision to organize a massive coordinated hunt involving the entire adult male population of the principality came from Margrave Johann Friedrich himself, who recognized that conventional methods had failed and that desperate times required desperate measures. The Margrave's declaration, issued on November 10th, called for every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 60 to participate in a systematic sweep of the forest that would leave no hiding place unexplored and no possible refuge for the creature that had terrorized their communities for so long. The Great Hunt represented more than simply a scaled-up version of conventional predator control. It was conceived as a form of holy war against the forces of evil, blessed by the Church and supported by prayers and religious ceremonies intended to invoke divine assistance in the battle against supernatural darkness. Father Brenner and other clergy throughout the region organized special services in the days leading up to the hunt, blessing the weapons of the participants and offering prayers for their success and safety. The organizational complexity of coordinating more than 800 men in a systematic search of hundreds of square miles of dense forest was unprecedented in the region's history. Military officers from the Margrave's Guard took responsibility for dividing the participants into manageable groups, each led by experienced hunters or woodsmen who could navigate the difficult terrain and coordinate their movements with those of neighboring units. The participants were organized into groups of 20 to 30 men, with each group assigned a specific sector of the forest to search. The overall strategy called for the groups to advance in coordinated fashion from the perimeter of the search area toward a central convergence point, driving any wolves present toward a killing ground where expert marksmen and experienced hunters would be positioned to make the final assault. The weapons carried by the hunting parties reflected both the serious nature of the threat and the supernatural fears that motivated many of the participants. Conventional hunting equipment, crossbows, muskets, spears, and various bladed weapons was supplemented by items that were intended to provide protection against supernatural forces. Holy water blessed by Father Brenner was distributed to group leaders, while many individual participants carried religious medals, crucifixes, and other sacred objects that they believed would shield them from evil influences. The hunt began at dawn on November 15th, with more than 800 men taking their assigned positions around the perimeter of the search area and beginning their coordinated advance toward the center. The early morning air was crisp and clear, with a light frost covering the fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor and making tracking conditions ideal for the experienced woodsmen who were guiding each group. The first day of the great hunt yielded numerous wolf sightings and the killing of 3 smaller wolves that were clearly not the creature responsible for the attacks on children, but these successes served to maintain morale and demonstrate that the systematic approach could be effective in locating and eliminating predatory animals. More importantly, the searchers discovered extensive evidence of the great wolf's presence throughout the forest: tracks, scent markings, feeding sites, and temporary resting places that revealed the creature's movement patterns and preferred habitats. The physical evidence gathered during the first day of hunting confirmed many of the observations that had been made by professional trackers and local woodsmen during previous efforts to locate the wolf. The creature was indeed of exceptional size, probably weighing over 150 pounds and measuring close to 6 feet from nose to tail. Its tracks showed distinctive characteristics that made them easily distinguishable from those of normal wolves, including unusual wear patterns on the claws and a gait that seemed to combine lupine and quasi-human characteristics. More disturbing were the discovery of several sites where the wolf had apparently engaged in behavior that served no obvious survival purpose. These locations, scattered throughout the forest, contained arrangements of bones, stones, and other objects that seemed to have been deliberately assembled rather than randomly accumulated. Some participants in the hunt reported feeling an inexplicable sense of unease when examining these sites, as if they were intrusion into places that had been marked for purposes that human understanding could not comprehend. The second day of the great hunt brought increasingly desperate searches through ever more remote and difficult terrain. The coordinated advance had succeeded in covering vast areas of forest and eliminating several possible hiding places, but the great wolf continued to elude capture. Several groups reported brief sightings of a large gray shape moving through the trees ahead of their advance, but these glimpses were always too fleeting and too distant to allow for effective pursuit or attack. The psychological strain of the hunt was beginning to affect many of the participants by the end of the second day. The constant tension of searching for a creature that might appear at any moment, combined with the eerie atmosphere created by the supernatural beliefs surrounding the wolf's identity, was taking its toll on men who were unaccustomed to this level of sustained stress and fear. Several participants reported difficulty sleeping and eating, while others complained of nightmares and waking visions that seemed to feature the wolf or its alleged human identity. Religious services were held each evening during the hunt, with Father Brenner offering prayers for continued divine protection and ultimate success in their mission. These gatherings served not only to maintain morale, but also to reinforce the spiritual dimensions of their struggle and to remind the participants that they were engaged in something far more significant than simple animal control. The hunt had become a test of the community's faith and determination, a battle between good and evil that would determine whether innocent children could once again play safely in the forests and fields of their homeland. It was on the morning of the third day that fortune finally favored the hunters. Wolfgang Dietrich, the professional tracker who had been leading one of the most experienced groups, discovered fresh tracks leading toward a rocky outcropping in a remote section of forest approximately 5 miles northeast of Ansbach. The tracks were unmistakably those of the great wolf, pressed deep into the soft earth and showing the distinctive gait that had been observed at numerous previous locations. The discovery generated immediate excitement throughout the hunting parties, as word spread rapidly through the coordinated communication system that had been established to keep the various groups informed of significant developments. For the first time since the great hunt had begun, the searchers had clear evidence that they were closing in on their quarry and might soon have the opportunity to confront the creature that had eluded their efforts for so long. Dietrich and his men followed the trail carefully, maintaining silence and coordinating their movements to prevent the wolf from detecting their approach. The tracks led through a dense grove of pine trees and then up a steep slope covered with loose stones and fallen logs, terrain that would favor the wolf if it decided to make a stand, but that also limited its escape routes if the hunters could surround the area effectively. As the trackers climbed the slope, they began to notice other signs of the wolf's presence that suggested they might be approaching its primary lair. The scent markings became more frequent and more recent, while the ground showed evidence of repeated passage over an extended period. Tufts of gray fur caught on thorny bushes indicated that the creature used this route regularly, probably returning to a sheltered location where it could rest safely between hunting expeditions. At the crest of the hill, the hunters made a discovery that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Hidden among a complex arrangement of large boulders and fallen trees was what appeared to be the wolf's primary den, a sophisticated shelter that provided protection from weather and concealment from potential threats while offering multiple escape routes if the need for flight should arise. The area around the den showed extensive signs of long-term occupation, including the scattered bones of various prey animals, well-worn paths leading in several directions, and clear evidence that the wolf had been using this location as its base of operations for an extended period. More disturbing were the human artifacts found among the debris scraps of clothing that appeared to have come from the wolf's young victims, small personal items that had apparently been brought back to the den as trophies, and other objects that provided grim evidence of the creature's methodical campaign against the children of the region. As Dietrich and his men examined the den more closely, they discovered that the wolf's shelter was centered around a partially collapsed well that had been dug decades earlier by charcoal burners working in the area. The well, approximately 8 feet deep and 4 feet in diameter, had been covered by fallen timber and accumulations of leaves and debris, creating a nearly perfect hiding place that would have been virtually impossible to detect without careful examination. The realization that they had discovered not just the wolf's lair, but potentially a trap from which the creature would have great difficulty escaping filled the hunters with a combination of excitement and apprehension. If the wolf was currently in the well, they would have the opportunity to corner it and bring the long hunt to a successful conclusion. However, the confined space and the creature's desperate situation would also make it extremely dangerous to approach, and the supernatural beliefs surrounding the wolf's identity added an additional layer of psychological pressure to an already tense situation. Dietrich immediately dispatched messengers to alert the other hunting groups and to call for reinforcements that could surround the area and prevent any possibility of the wolf's escape. Within 2 hours, More than 100 men had converged on the rocky outcropping, forming a wide circle around the den site and positioning themselves at strategic points where they could intercept the creature if it attempted to flee. The preparations for the final confrontation were methodical and thorough, reflecting both the hunters' experience with dangerous game and their understanding of the particular threat posed by this exceptional predator. Barriers were constructed from fallen logs and stones to channel the wolf's movement in predictable directions, while archers and marksmen took positions that would allow them clear shots at the well opening when the creature eventually emerged. The psychological preparation for the confrontation was as important as the physical arrangements. Father Brenner had accompanied the converging hunters, and now led them in prayers that combined requests for divine protection with acknowledgments of the spiritual significance of what they were about to attempt. Holy water was sprinkled around the den site and on the weapons of the men who would be closest to the action, while religious medals and crosses were displayed prominently to invoke supernatural protection against whatever evil forces might be associated with the wolf. As afternoon faded toward evening and the moment for forcing the confrontation approached, a profound silence settled over the assembled hunters. The normal sounds of the forest bird songs, rustling leaves, the distant calls of other animals seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of human breathing and heartbeats as more than 100 men prepared to face the creature that had terrorized their communities for so long. The time had come to discover whether their long hunt would end in triumph or tragedy, and whether the nightmare that had gripped the principality for months would finally come to an end. As the shadows lengthened and evening approached on that cold November day, Wolfgang Dietrich made the decision to force the final confrontation that would determine the fate of both the hunters and their supernatural quarry. The professional tracker had faced dangerous animals throughout his career, but never before had he been part of an operation that carried such symbolic weight and spiritual significance for an entire community. The wolf trapped in the ancient well represented more than simply a predatory threat. It was the embodiment of evil itself, and its destruction would serve as a form of divine justice that had been delayed for far too long. The approach to the well required careful coordination among the hunters who would be directly involved in the assault. Dietrich selected 2 other experienced men to accompany him in the initial approach. Heinrich Weber, a local hunter whose knowledge of the terrain was invaluable, and Johann Fuchs, the forester who had previously encountered the wolf and whose steady nerves and woodcraft skills had earned him the respect of his peers. The 3 men approached the covered opening of the well cautiously, carrying burning brands that would serve both to illuminate the interior and to drive the creature from its hiding place if it proved reluctant to emerge. The flames cast dancing shadows across the rocky outcropping and created an atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the supernatural drama that was about to unfold. Behind them, the assembled hunters maintained their positions with weapons ready, prepared to deliver the killing shots that would end the wolf's reign of terror. The first indication that the creature was indeed trapped in the well came from the sound of breathing. Deep, regular inhalations and exhalations that echoed from the depths with an almost human quality that sent shivers through the men who heard it. This was not the panting of a frightened animal or the labored breathing of an exhausted predator, but rather something that seemed deliberate and controlled, as if the creature were preparing itself for the confrontation that was about to occur. Dietrich called out a challenge in a voice that carried across the clearing and drew responding calls of encouragement from the surrounding hunters. His words, delivered in the local dialect but infused with formal phrases borrowed from hunting traditions, demanded that the creature show itself and face the justice that had been so long delayed. The response that came from the depths of the well was unlike anything that any of the assembled men had ever heard before. The sound that emerged from the darkness below was a growl that seemed to combine the natural vocalizations of a large predator with overtones that were disturbingly human in character. The growling rose and fell in patterns that almost resembled speech, and several of the hunters later swore that they could distinguish words or phrases embedded in the animal sounds, fragments of curses or threats delivered in what they recognized as Klaus Stumpel's voice. though transformed by supernatural forces into something that was barely recognizable as human communication. As the growling continued and intensified, it was joined by the sounds of movement from within the well, scraping noises that suggested the creature was attempting to climb the stone walls of its prison, accompanied by impacts that indicated it was throwing itself against the sides of the confined space in its efforts to escape. The sounds created an impression of barely contained violence and rage that seemed to exceed anything that normal animal psychology could account for. The assembled hunters listened to these sounds with a mixture of fascination and terror, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. This was not simply a cornered animal fighting for survival, but rather the manifestation of evil forces that had been disturbed in their hidden refuge and were now preparing to unleash their full fury against those who had dared to challenge them. Father Brenner, standing among the circle of hunters, raised his voice in prayers that were intended to provide spiritual protection and divine assistance for the confrontation that was about to begin. His Latin phrases, delivered in the formal cadences of ecclesiastical ritual, seemed to provide a counterpoint to the unholy sounds emerging from the well, creating a sense of cosmic struggle between opposing forces of good and evil. Suddenly, with explosive violence that caught even the prepared hunters off guard, the wolf launched itself toward the opening of the well. The massive gray form erupted from the darkness like a living projectile, its powerful legs driving it upward toward freedom with a force that seemed to exceed the physical capabilities of any normal animal. For a moment, silhouetted against the darkening sky with its eyes reflecting the light of the torches, the creature appeared to be something out of the deepest nightmares of European folklore. A demonic entity that had assumed bestial form for the purpose of tormenting humanity. The wolf that emerged from the well was indeed of extraordinary size, confirming all the reports that had circulated throughout the hunting expedition. Its body measured nearly 6 feet from nose to tail, with a height at the shoulder that brought its head almost to the level of a standing man. The creature's coat was a distinctive silver gray that seemed to shimmer in the firelight, while its eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably human despite the bestial features that surrounded them. Most disturbing of all were the wolf's facial features, which seemed to combine lupine characteristics with human elements in ways that created an effect that was profoundly unsettling to observe. Several of the hunters later reported that they could see traces of Klaus Stumpel's features in the creature's face. The same cruel eyes, the same expression of malicious intelligence, the same apparent pleasure in causing fear and suffering that had characterized the administrator during his lifetime. However, the professional hunters were prepared for exactly such an escape attempt. As the wolf's head and shoulders emerged from the well opening, multiple weapons struck it simultaneously from different directions. Crossbow bolts and musket balls found their mark with deadly accuracy, while spears thrust by experienced hands pierced the creature's body at vital points. The coordinated attack had been planned and rehearsed during the hours of preparation, and it was executed with a precision that only came from extensive experience with dangerous game. Dietrich himself delivered what proved to be the killing blow with a heavy boar spear, driving the iron point deep into the creature's chest and pinning it against the stone edge of the well. The spear, crafted specifically for dealing with large and dangerous animals, penetrated the wolf's heart and lungs, causing massive internal damage that would have been fatal to any normal creature within moments of the impact. Yet even with mortal wounds that should have killed it instantly, the wolf continued to struggle with a ferocity that amazed and terrified the hunters who surrounded it. The creature's powerful body thrashed against the spear shaft, its massive jaws snapping at anything within reach, and its eyes maintaining their expression of malevolent intelligence even as its life began to ebb away. The sounds it made during these final struggles combined animal vocalizations with what several witnesses swore were human words, curses and threats directed at specific individuals among the hunting party, delivered in voices that seemed to shift between the wolf's natural growling and recognizably human speech patterns. The death throes of the creature lasted for several minutes, during which time none of the assembled hunters dared to approach closer or to attempt to hasten its end. There was something about the wolf's continued struggle and the supernatural associations that surrounded its identity that made even the most experienced men reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be a cosmic struggle between life and death, good and evil, natural and supernatural forces. Finally, as the last light of day faded from the sky and the torches became the only source of illumination in the clearing, the wolf's struggles ceased and its massive body lay still. The silence that followed was profound and complete, as if the entire forest were holding its breath in recognition of the significance of what had just occurred. The creature that had terrorized the principality for months, claimed the lives of 14 innocent children, and transformed peaceful communities into landscapes of fear and suspicion, was finally dead. Relief was the most immediate response. The long nightmare was finally over, and children throughout the region could once again play safely without fear of supernatural predation. However, this relief was tempered by awe at what they had witnessed and lingering uncertainty about whether the creature's death would truly end the supernatural threat that it had represented. Several men crossed themselves and offered prayers of thanksgiving, while others approached the creature's body with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Even in death, the wolf remained a formidable sight, its massive form and distinctive features serving as tangible proof that the stories and fears that had circulated throughout the community had been based on genuine supernatural phenomena rather than mere superstition and hysteria. The examination of the wolf's body provided additional confirmation that this had been no ordinary predator. The creature's size and physical characteristics were unlike anything that the most experienced hunters had encountered in decades of tracking and killing wolves throughout the region. Its teeth were exceptionally long and sharp, adapted not just for tearing flesh, but for inflicting the specific types of wounds that had been found on its human victims. More disturbing were the creature's paws and claws, which showed wear patterns that suggested activities far removed from normal lupine behavior. The claws bore evidence of extensive digging and climbing, but also of manipulation that seemed to require quasi-human dexterity and intelligence. Several of the hunters commented on the unusual flexibility of the creature's front paws, which appeared capable of grasping and manipulating objects in ways that normal wolf anatomy would not permit. Perhaps most significant of all were the facial features that had struck so many observers as disturbingly human in character. Close examination revealed bone structure and muscle configuration that seemed to combine human and lupine characteristics in ways that violated every assumption about natural anatomy and development. The creature's skull shape, the positioning of its eyes, and the configuration of its jaw all suggested either a completely unknown species of wolf or something that had undergone supernatural transformation from human to animal form. As word of the wolf's death began to spread beyond the immediate circle of hunters, crowds of people started making their way through the forest to witness for themselves the end of the creature that had terrorized their communities. Parents brought their children to see the dead predator and to understand that the threat was finally over, while adults who had lived in fear for months finally began to believe that normal life could resume. The massive corpse was loaded onto a specially constructed cart and covered with a cloth that had been blessed by Father Brenner, while the hunters who had participated in its death formed an honor guard that would accompany the body on its journey to the town square. However, even as the immediate threat had been eliminated and the community could begin to celebrate its deliverance, questions remained about how to properly commemorate the event and ensure that the supernatural evil represented by the wolf would not return to threaten future generations. The creature's death was only the beginning of a process that would transform a simple hunting success into one of the most elaborate and symbolic displays of popular justice in European history. The wolf was dead, but its story was far from over. In the days that followed, the citizens of Ansbach would create a spectacle that would be remembered for centuries as a testament to their ingenuity, their determination, and their understanding of the symbolic power required to truly defeat supernatural evil. The transportation of the massive wolf's carcass from the remote forest clearing to the town of Ansbach marked the beginning of a transformation that would elevate a successful hunt into something approaching a theatrical performance of cosmic justice. As news of the creature's death spread throughout the principality, crowds gathered along the roads to witness the passage of the cart bearing the body of their former tormentor, and spontaneous celebrations erupted in villages that had lived under the shadow of fear for months. However, even as the immediate relief of victory began to settle over the communities, thoughtful citizens and religious authorities recognized that the wolf's death, while necessary, was not sufficient to address the supernatural dimensions of the crisis they had faced. If the creature had indeed been the reincarnated spirit of Klaus Stumple, as many firmly believed, then its treatment and death should reflect both the justice that had been denied during the administrator's lifetime and the community's determination to ensure that his evil influence would not continue beyond the grave. The proposal for an elaborate public display of the wolf emerged from discussions among community leaders, religious authorities, and citizens who understood the power of symbolic action to reinforce social values and provide psychological closure for traumatic events. The idea was both simple and profound. The wolf would be dressed in human clothing that would identify it specifically as Klaus Stumple, and it would be displayed in the town square in a manner that would serve simultaneously as entertainment, education, and a form of posthumous justice that had been denied during the administrator's earthly existence. This plan appealed to multiple segments of the community for different but complementary reasons. The common people, who had suffered most directly under Stumple's cruelties, saw the proposal as an opportunity to exact symbolic revenge against their former oppressor while celebrating their ultimate triumph over the forces of evil. The educated classes viewed it as a sophisticated form of moral instruction that would demonstrate the inevitable consequences of corruption and tyranny. Religious authorities embraced it as a visible manifestation of divine justice and a powerful reminder of the eternal struggle between good and evil. The task of preparing the wolf's body for its ceremonial transformation fell to Johann Weber, the town's most skilled taxidermist and the father of Anna Weber, one of the wolf's young victims. Weber's personal involvement in the project added an additional layer of symbolic significance to the proceedings, as the man who had lost his daughter to the creature's depredations would now be responsible for transforming it into an object of ridicule and public entertainment. Weber approached the unusual commission with professional dedication tempered by personal emotion that gave his work an intensity and attention to detail that exceeded even his normal high standards. The wolf's massive body was carefully skinned, using techniques that preserved every detail of its distinctive features, from the unusually human-like facial structure to the powerful limbs that had enabled its supernatural hunting abilities. The preservation process itself became a form of ritual that attracted observers from throughout the region. Weber worked in a specially prepared building near the town square, with windows that allowed curious citizens to observe the transformation of their former tormentor from a creature of terror into a manageable object that could be controlled and manipulated according to human will. The taxidermist's skilled hands, guided by decades of experience in preparing hunting trophies for wealthy patrons, treated the wolf's remains with the same care and precision that he would have devoted to any valuable specimen. The stuffing and mounting of the wolf required innovative techniques to accommodate both its exceptional size and the specific poses that would be required for the public display. Traditional taxidermy methods had to be modified to support the creature's massive frame while maintaining a natural appearance that would enhance the dramatic impact of the costume and accessories that would complete the transformation. While Weber worked on the physical preparation of the wolf, other members of the community took responsibility for assembling the costume and accessories that would complete the symbolic transformation from beast back to human form. The selection of appropriate clothing required careful consideration of both historical accuracy and symbolic effectiveness, as the garments chosen would need to be immediately recognizable as those worn by administrative officials, while also conveying the specific identity of Klaus Stumple. Local tailors and seamstresses, many of whom had personal reasons to despise Stumple's memory, volunteered their services for the project with enthusiasm that reflected both their professional pride and their emotional investment in seeing justice finally served. The clothing they created was based on contemporary administrative fashion, but exaggerated in certain details to enhance its theatrical impact and ensure that even observers unfamiliar with bureaucratic dress codes would understand the symbolic message being conveyed. The coat selected for the wolf was crafted from dark blue wool of the finest quality available in the region, with silver buttons that caught the light and gleamed with metallic brilliance. The garment was tailored to fit the wolf's unusual proportions, while maintaining the formal appearance appropriate to a man of Stumple's former position and social status. Knee-length breeches of matching material were designed to accommodate the creature's powerful hindquarters, while preserving the dignity and authority associated with official administrative dress. White stockings and black shoes with silver buckles completed the lower portion of the costume, while a white shirt with elaborate lace cuffs added the refinement expected of a prosperous government official. The shirt was specially modified to fit around the wolf's chest and shoulders while maintaining the appearance of proper human proportions, creating an effect that was both convincing and subtly unsettling to observers who examined it closely. The most significant element of the costume was a powdered wig that had been specially commissioned from a skilled craftsman in the nearby city of Nuremberg. The wigmaker had been provided with detailed descriptions of Klaus Stumple's appearance from multiple witnesses who had known the administrator during his lifetime, allowing him to create a remarkably accurate reproduction of the man's distinctive hairstyle and facial features. The wig was constructed from human hair obtained from various sources throughout the region, with the color and texture carefully matched to contemporary accounts of Stumple's appearance. The styling reflected the fashion preferences of administrative officials in the 1680s, while incorporating specific details that would make the intended identity unmistakable to anyone who had known the former administrator. The face beneath the wig presented the most complex challenge in the transformation process, as it needed to suggest human features while working within the constraints imposed by the wolf's natural anatomy. Skilled artists and craftsmen collaborated to create a mask that would fit over the creature's muzzle and facial structure, transforming lupine features into a recognizable approximation of Klaus Stumple's human face. The mask was crafted from materials that included plaster, paint, and various cosmetic substances that could create the appearance of human skin and facial features. The artist worked from portraits and detailed descriptions to ensure accuracy in reproducing Stumple's distinctive nose, cheekbones, and other identifying characteristics, while also incorporating elements that would suggest the supernatural transformation that had allegedly taken place. The eyes of the mask were perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire transformation, as they were designed to capture the malevolent intelligence that witnesses had observed in both the living administrator and the supernatural wolf. Glass eyes were specially crafted to reflect light in ways that would create an impression of awareness and calculation, while the positioning and shape were adjusted to suggest the predatory nature that had driven the creature's campaign against innocent children. As news of the elaborate preparations spread throughout the Principality and beyond, anticipation grew for what was being described as an unprecedented display of popular justice and community creativity. Visitors began arriving in Ansbach from neighboring territories, drawn by curiosity about the unusual spectacle and eager to witness what many viewed as a revolutionary approach to dealing with supernatural threats. The formal unveiling of the transformed wolf was scheduled for November 30th, 1685, allowing sufficient time for the completion of all preparation work and for people from throughout the region to make arrangements to attend the ceremony. The town square was modified to accommodate the expected crowds. with the construction of a raised platform where the dressed wolf would be displayed and temporary structures that would allow for the participation of both secular and religious authorities in the proceedings. The platform itself became a work of art that reflected the community's investment in creating a memorable and meaningful spectacle. Local craftsmen donated their time and materials to construct a stage that would provide optimal viewing angles for the crowd, while also creating a setting appropriate to the significance of the occasion. The platform was decorated with carved reliefs depicting scenes of justice and divine retribution, while banners and other ornamental elements reinforced the themes of community triumph over evil forces. Arrangements were made for the participation of various authorities and dignitaries who would lend their presence and approval to the proceedings. Margrave Johann Friedrich himself expressed interest in attending the ceremony, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate his government's effectiveness in protecting the people, while also showing support for innovative approaches to maintaining social order and community morale. Religious authorities prepared special prayers and ceremonial elements that would emphasize the spiritual significance of the transformation and display. Father Brenner worked with colleagues from neighboring parishes to develop a service that would combine thanksgiving for the community's deliverance with prayers for continued protection against supernatural threats, while also providing theological context for the unusual methods being employed to ensure final victory over evil forces. The days leading up to the ceremony were filled with a festive atmosphere that had been absent from the region for months. Children who had been confined to their homes by parental fears were finally allowed to play freely in the streets, while adults who had lived under constant anxiety began to relax and enjoy normal social interactions that had been impossible during the period of terror. Markets bustled with unusual activity as people prepared for the ceremony, and visitors from other regions arrived to witness the spectacle. Taverns and inns found themselves overwhelmed with customers, while local craftsmen and merchants enjoyed unprecedented demand for their goods and services. The transformation of the wolf had become not just a form of justice, but also an economic stimulus that brought prosperity to communities that had suffered significant hardship during the months of crisis. Musicians and entertainers began arriving in Ansbach to provide accompaniment for what was expected to be a celebration as well as a ceremony. Traditional songs were adapted to commemorate the defeat of the wolf, while new compositions were created specifically for the occasion. Storytellers prepared accounts of the great hunt and its successful conclusion, ensuring that the events would be preserved in oral tradition and passed down to future generations. The anticipation that built during the final days before the ceremony reflected the community's understanding that they were about to participate in something far more significant than a simple display of a hunting trophy. This would be a definitive statement about their values, their capabilities, and their determination to maintain control over the forces that threaten their children and their way of life. The dressed wolf, now complete with all its costume and accessories, represented the transformation of terror into triumph, of supernatural threat into manageable spectacle, of community victimization into collective empowerment. The creature that had stalked their forests and claimed their children was about to become an object of entertainment and instruction, a testament to human ingenuity and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable evil. The town square, which had been the center of commercial and social life for generations, had been transformed into something resembling an ancient amphitheater, with the raised platform holding the dressed wolf serving as the focal point for what promised to be one of the most remarkable spectacles in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. Crowds began gathering in the square well before sunrise, with people traveling from villages throughout the principality and beyond to witness the culmination of the community's struggle against supernatural evil. The early arrivals claimed the best viewing positions near the platform, while later comers filled the surrounding streets and climbed onto rooftops and balconies that offered glimpses at the proceedings below. The diversity of the crowd reflected the broad appeal of the spectacle that was about to unfold. peasants and farmers who had lived in daily fear for their children's safety stood alongside merchants and craftsmen whose businesses had suffered during the months of crisis. Scholars and clerics who had debated the theological implications of the wolf attacks mingled with hunters and soldiers who had participated in the great hunt that had brought the creature to its end. Children were particularly numerous among the assembled observers, their parents having brought them specifically to witness the transformation of their former tormentor into an object of ridicule and control. Many of these young people had been confined to their homes for months, forbidden from engaging in the outdoor activities that were essential to childhood development and happiness. Their presence at the ceremony represented not just curiosity about an unusual spectacle, but also a form of liberation from the fear that had dominated their lives for far too long. The atmosphere in the square combined elements of a religious festival, a secular celebration, and a form of popular theater that engaged multiple senses and emotions simultaneously. Vendors moved through the crowd selling food, drink, and small souvenirs that commemorated the defeat of the wolf, while musicians provided entertainment that ranged from traditional folk songs to newly composed ballads that celebrated the community's triumph over supernatural evil. The air was filled with the sense of roasted meat, mulled wine, and fresh bread, creating an aromatic backdrop that enhanced the festive mood and reminded everyone present that normal life had been restored to their communities. The sounds of laughter, conversation, and music replaced the whispered fears and anxious consultations that had characterized public gatherings during the months of terror, while the bright colors of holiday clothing and decorative banners contrasted sharply with the somber atmosphere that had previously dominated community events. As midday approached, the formal participants in the ceremony began to take their positions around the platform. Margrave Johann Friedrich arrived with a retinue that included military officers, court officials, and distinguished visitors who had traveled from other principalities to witness the unusual proceedings. The Margrave's presence lent official legitimacy to the community's creative approach to dealing with supernatural threats while also demonstrating his government's commitment to protecting the welfare of its citizens. Religious authorities, led by Father Brenner and including clergy from parishes throughout the region, assembled near the platform in vestments that reflected both the celebratory and solemn aspects of the occasion. Their participation would provide theological context for the proceedings, while also offering prayers of thanksgiving for the community's deliverance and supplications for continued divine protection against evil forces. The hunters who had participated in the Great Hunt and the final confrontation with the wolf occupied positions of honor that reflected their role as the community's champions in the struggle against supernatural evil. Wolfgang Dietrich and the professional hunters who had led the expedition were joined by local woodsmen, farmers, and townspeople who had contributed to the successful conclusion of the crisis, creating a visible representation of community cooperation and determination. The moment that the crowd had been waiting for arrived when the covering was removed from the platform, revealing the dressed wolf in all its elaborate theatrical glory. The sight that greeted the assembled observers exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of those who had planned and executed the transformation, creating an effect that was simultaneously entertaining, disturbing, and profoundly meaningful. The wolf, now standing upright on its hind legs and supported by an internal framework that maintained the pose, was dressed in the complete costume of a 17th-century administrative official. The dark blue coat with its gleaming silver buttons, the white shirt with elaborate lace cuffs, the knee-length breeches, white stockings, and black shoes with silver buckles created a convincing impression of human form and dignity that was only enhanced by the powdered wig and facial mask that transformed lupine features into a recognizable approximation of Klaus Stumpel's human appearance. The initial reaction of the crowd was a moment of stunned silence, as thousands of people simultaneously processed the visual impact of what they were seeing. The transformation was so complete and so convincing that many observers experienced a momentary confusion about whether they were looking at a dressed animal or a human figure, and the psychological effect of this uncertainty added to the power of the spectacle. The silence was broken by scattered laughter and applause that quickly spread throughout the crowd as people began to appreciate the creativity and skill that had gone into the transformation. The laughter was not merely amusement at an entertaining spectacle, but also a form of emotional release that reflected the community's joy at finally being able to ridicule and control the source of their former terror. Children were among the most enthusiastic respondents to the display, pointing at the dressed wolf and expressing delight at seeing their former tormentor reduced to an object of entertainment and derision. Parents who had spent months fearing for their children's safety now watched with satisfaction as their young ones laughed at the creature that had once filled their nightmares with images of supernatural predation and death. The formal ceremony began with prayers offered by Father Brenner, who spoke about the eternal struggle between good and evil and the importance of remaining vigilant against forces that would threaten the innocent and helpless. His words, delivered in the rhythmic cadences of liturgical Latin interspersed with passages in the local dialect, provided theological context for the unusual proceedings while also reinforcing the spiritual significance of what the community had accomplished. The priest's sermon emphasized themes of divine justice, community cooperation, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil that resonated powerfully with an audience that had experienced firsthand the reality of supernatural threats and the effectiveness of collective action in confronting them. His blessing of the dressed wolf served to sanctify the transformation and ensure that it would serve as a permanent barrier against the return of evil forces rather than merely a temporary entertainment. Margrave Johann Friedrich addressed the crowd with words that praised the courage and determination of all who had participated in the Great Hunt, while also acknowledging the innovative approach that had been taken to commemorate their victory. His speech emphasized the restoration of safety and order throughout the principality, while also recognizing the symbolic importance of the display and demonstrating the community's refusal to be intimidated by supernatural threats. The Margrave's remarks included specific recognition of the professional hunters, local volunteers, religious authorities, and craftsmen who had contributed to the successful conclusion of the crisis, creating a sense of shared accomplishment that strengthened community bonds and reinforced social cohesion. His approval of the unusual methods employed in dealing with the wolf's remains provided official legitimacy for what might otherwise have been viewed as merely a bizarre form of popular entertainment. Wolfgang Dietrich spoke on behalf of the hunting party, describing the challenges they had faced in tracking and killing a creature that seemed to possess supernatural abilities and intelligence far beyond those of normal predatory animals. His account of the final confrontation at the ancient well provided dramatic details that held the crowd's attention while also emphasizing the courage and skill required to bring the long hunt to a successful conclusion. The tracker's description of the wolf's behavior during its final moments, including the apparently human vocalizations and the supernatural strength it had displayed even while mortally wounded, reinforced the belief that they had been dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than simple animal predation. His testimony provided additional validation for the community's supernatural interpretation of events, while also celebrating the ultimate triumph of human courage and determination over evil forces. The ceremonial aspects of the display were accompanied by various forms of popular entertainment that reflected the community's creativity and their understanding of the importance of combining serious themes with engaging spectacle. Musicians performed compositions that had been created specifically for the occasion, including songs that told the story of the Great Hunt and ballads that celebrated the transformation of terror into triumph. Storytellers recounted the events that had led to the wolf's death and transformation, adding dramatic details and moral lessons that would ensure the preservation of these events in popular memory and oral tradition. Their performances served both as entertainment for the current audience, and as a means of educating future generations about the importance of community cooperation in confronting threats to social order and public safety. The display of the dressed wolf continued for several hours, during which time thousands of people had the opportunity to examine the transformation up close and to understand the skill and creativity that had gone into its creation. Many observers commented on the remarkable accuracy with which Klaus Stumpel's appearance had been reproduced, while others focused on the symbolic significance of seeing their former oppressor reduced to an object of ridicule and popular entertainment. Children were encouraged to approach the platform and examine the dressed wolf closely, their parents understanding that direct confrontation with their former source of fear was essential for complete psychological recovery from the trauma they had experienced. The laughter and comments of these young people as they studied the transformed creature provided powerful evidence that the community's approach to dealing with supernatural threats had been both effective and psychologically sound. As afternoon faded toward evening and the formal ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse with expressions of satisfaction and renewed confidence that reflected the successful conclusion of a crisis that had threatened to destroy their way of life. The transformation of the Wolf of Ansbach from a source of terror into an object of entertainment and instruction represented more than simply an unusual approach to dealing with the aftermath of a successful hunt. It demonstrated the power of human creativity and community cooperation to impose meaning and control on experiences that might otherwise remain sources of fear and confusion, while also providing a model for future generations who might face similar challenges to social order and public safety. The dressed wolf standing in the town square of Ansbach had become a symbol of community triumph over evil forces, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of supernatural threats, and a permanent reminder that even the most terrifying enemies could be transformed into sources of strength and pride through the application of courage, determination, and collective action. The public display of the dressed wolf continued for 8 days following the formal ceremony, during which time the spectacle attracted visitors from throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Word of the unusual approach taken by the people of Ansbach spread rapidly through the networks of merchants, clergy, and traveling scholars who connected the scattered principalities and city-states of Central Europe, carrying with it detailed descriptions of both the great hunt and the elaborate transformation that had followed the creature's death. The continuing crowds that gathered to view the dressed wolf included not only local residents and regional visitors, but also delegations of officials from other territories who were interested in observing innovative approaches to maintaining public order and community morale. Representatives from neighboring principalities studied the display with professional interest, recognizing that the methods employed in Ansbach might be adapted to address similar challenges in their own domains. Scholars and natural philosophers arrived to examine the physical evidence of what was being interpreted as a confirmed case of lycanthropy, taking detailed measurements and making careful observations that would contribute to academic discussions about the nature of supernatural transformation. Their presence lent scholarly credibility to the community's interpretation of events, while also ensuring that the case would be documented in learned treatises and philosophical works that would preserve it for future study. Artists and craftsmen came to study the techniques that had been employed in transforming the wolf's remains into a convincing human figure, recognizing that the skills demonstrated by Johann Weber and his collaborators represented innovations in taxidermy and theatrical design that could be applied to other projects. The artistic achievement represented by the dressed wolf was as significant as its symbolic and social functions, demonstrating the sophisticated technical capabilities that existed within provincial communities throughout the empire. Writers and publishers recognized the commercial potential of the story and began producing pamphlets, broadsheets, and illustrated accounts that would carry the tale of the Wolf of Ansbach to audiences throughout Europe and beyond. These publications, ranging from simple news reports to elaborate narratives filled with moral instruction and supernatural speculation, ensured that the events would be preserved in written form and made available to readers who would never have the opportunity to witness the physical display. The economic impact of the continuing spectacle was substantial and beneficial for the local community, as the constant stream of visitors required food, lodging, and various services that provided income for people whose livelihoods had been disrupted during the months of crisis. Taverns and inns found themselves operating at capacity for the first time in months, while local merchants, craftsmen, and food vendors enjoyed unprecedented demand for their goods and services. The psychological effects of the display were perhaps even more significant than its economic benefits. The sight of their former tormentor transformed into an object of ridicule and control provided powerful evidence to local residents that the supernatural threat had been permanently eliminated and that normal life could resume without fear of renewed attacks. Children who had been traumatized by months of confinement and anxiety began to exhibit signs of recovery as they observed their parents' confidence and participated in the celebratory atmosphere surrounding the display. The transformation of collective trauma into community triumph demonstrated the power of symbolic action to facilitate psychological healing and social recovery from crisis situations. The dressed wolf served as a focal point for emotions and experiences that might otherwise have remained sources of ongoing anxiety and disruption, allowing the community to process their trauma through shared participation in a meaningful and empowering spectacle. Religious authorities throughout the region recognized the theological significance of what had been accomplished in Ansbach and began incorporating the story into sermons and instructional materials that emphasized themes of divine justice, community cooperation, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. The case became a standard example cited by clergy who sought to demonstrate the reality of supernatural forces and the importance of maintaining vigilance against evil influences. The dressed wolf was also used as evidence in academic and legal discussions about the nature of lycanthropy and the appropriate methods for dealing with alleged cases of supernatural transformation. Legal scholars studied the procedures that had been followed in investigating and prosecuting the case, while theologians debated the implications of the community's response for broader understanding of divine justice and human responsibility in confronting evil. After 8 days of continuous public display, the dressed wolf was carefully removed from the platform and transported to a specially prepared location where it would be preserved for future reference and study. The decision to maintain the display permanently reflected both the community's recognition of its historical significance and their understanding that it would continue to serve important functions for education, entertainment, and psychological reassurance. The permanent installation of the dressed wolf was designed to maximize its symbolic impact, while also ensuring its physical preservation for future generations. The display was housed in a purpose-built structure that protected it from weather and deterioration while allowing continued public access for those who wish to study or simply observe this unique artifact of community creativity and supernatural history. The preservation of the dressed wolf ensured that it would continue to serve as a testament to the events of 1685 and as a reminder of the community's successful response to supernatural crisis. Visitors who came to Ansbach in subsequent years would have the opportunity to witness physical evidence of the Great Hunt and to understand the innovative methods that had been employed to transform terror into triumph. The story of the Wolf of Ansbach began to influence popular culture throughout Europe as it was incorporated into folklore, literature, and various forms of entertainment that carried its themes and lessons to audiences far removed from the original events. Traveling performers adapted the tale for dramatic presentation, while storytellers and ballad singers ensured that it would be preserved in oral tradition and transmitted to future generations. The case became one of the most widely cited examples of lycanthropy in European folklore and academic literature, referenced by scholars, writers, and religious authorities who sought to demonstrate the reality of supernatural transformation and the appropriate methods for dealing with such phenomena. Its influence extended beyond academic circles to affect popular beliefs and practices related to the identification and treatment of alleged werewolves throughout Central and Northern Europe. The innovative approach taken by the people of Ansbach in dealing with the aftermath of their supernatural crisis provided a model that was studied and occasionally imitated by other communities that faced similar challenges. The combination of practical action, symbolic transformation, and community participation demonstrated effective methods for maintaining social cohesion and public confidence in the face of threats that challenged conventional understanding of natural and supernatural phenomena. The long-term impact of the Wolf of Ansbach extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the crisis that had prompted the Great Hunt and the elaborate display that followed. The events of 1685 became part of the historical identity of the region, contributing to a sense of community pride and resilience that would influence local culture for generations to come. The techniques developed for tracking, hunting, and eliminating dangerous predators were refined and systematized based on the experience gained during the Great Hunt, creating improved methods for dealing with future threats to public safety. The organizational skills and community cooperation that had been demonstrated during the crisis provided a foundation for other collective endeavors that would benefit the region in subsequent years. The artistic and technical innovations that had been employed in creating the dressed wolf contributed to advances in taxidermy, theatrical design, and public display techniques that found applications in other contexts throughout the region and beyond. The skills and creativity that had been demonstrated during the project enhanced the reputation of local craftsmen and artists, while also providing practical knowledge that could be applied to other challenges and opportunities. The preserved display continued to attract visitors for decades following the original events, generating ongoing economic benefits for the local community while also serving as a unique tourist attraction that distinguished Ansbach from other principalities and city-states throughout the empire. The story of the Great Hunt and its aftermath became an integral part of the region's identity and a source of pride that enhanced its reputation throughout Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the events of 1685 demonstrated the power of human creativity, courage, and community cooperation to overcome even the most terrifying challenges to social order and public safety. The transformation of the Wolf of Ansbach from a source of supernatural terror into an object of entertainment and instruction provided a model for future generations who might face similar threats to their communities and their way of life. The dressed wolf that stood as a permanent testament to the community's triumph over evil forces would remain a symbol of human ingenuity and determination for centuries to come, reminding all who saw it that even the most supernatural manifestations of evil could be defeated through the application of courage, intelligence, and collective action. The legacy of the Beast of Ansbach would endure long after the immediate crisis had been forgotten, serving as both historical artifact and moral instruction for generations yet unborn. The winter of 1685 passed peacefully in the Principality of Ansbach, with children playing freely in snow-covered fields and parents sleeping soundly for the first time in months. The absence of further attacks, combined with the visible proof of the wolf's death and transformation that stood in the town square, provided definitive evidence that the supernatural threat had been permanently eliminated and that normal life had been restored to the communities that had suffered under its reign of terror. Spring brought renewed prosperity to the region, as agricultural activities resumed their normal patterns and trade relationships that had been disrupted during the crisis were re-established with neighboring territories. The story of the Great Hunt and the innovative response to its successful conclusion had enhanced the reputation of the principality throughout the Holy Roman Empire, attracting new settlers, merchants, and skilled craftsmen who were drawn by the community's demonstrated resilience and creativity. The dressed wolf remained a popular attraction for visitors from throughout Europe and beyond, generating continuing revenue for local businesses while also serving as a unique form of historical documentation that preserved the events of 1685 in tangible form. Scholars and students came to study what was widely regarded as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of lycanthropy in European history, while artists and writers found inspiration in the story's themes of community cooperation and triumph over supernatural evil. The techniques and procedures that had been developed during the Great Hunt were systematized and documented, creating a body of knowledge about predator control and community organization that would prove valuable for future generations facing similar challenges. The organizational methods employed in coordinating the efforts of hundreds of hunters across vast areas of difficult terrain provided models for military operations, disaster response, and other large-scale community endeavors. The artistic and technical innovations that had been demonstrated in the creation of the dressed wolf influenced developments in taxidermy, theatrical design, and public commemoration throughout the region and beyond. The skills and creativity that had been applied to transforming the wolf's remains into a convincing human figure were recognized as significant achievements in their own right, independent of their symbolic and psychological functions. The religious and theological implications of the case continued to be debated by clergy and scholars for decades following the original events, with the story serving as a standard reference point for discussions about the nature of evil, the reality of supernatural transformation, and the appropriate methods for confronting threats to Christian communities. The success of the community's response was interpreted as validation of the power of faith, prayer, and collective action to overcome even the most daunting challenges to social order and spiritual well-being. The legal precedents established during the investigation and response to the wolf attacks influenced procedures for dealing with similar cases throughout the German-speaking territories of the empire, while the documentation and preservation of evidence set standards for record-keeping and case management that would benefit future legal and administrative proceedings. The educational value of the story was recognized by parents, teachers, and religious authorities who incorporated it into instructional materials and moral lessons designed to teach children and young people about the importance of courage, community cooperation, and vigilance against evil influences. The tale became a standard part of local folklore and oral tradition, ensuring its preservation and transmission to future generations. The psychological insights that had been gained through the community's experience with collective trauma and recovery provided understanding that would prove valuable in addressing other crisis situations that might threaten social cohesion and individual well-being. The methods that had been employed to transform terror into triumph demonstrated the power of symbolic action and community participation to facilitate healing and restore confidence in the face of overwhelming challenges. As the 17th century drew to a close and new challenges emerged to confront the communities of Central Europe, the story of the Wolf of Ansbach remained a source of inspiration and practical guidance for those who faced threats to their safety, their values, and their way of life. The lessons learned during those terrifying months of 1685 continued to resonate through subsequent generations, providing both historical perspective and contemporary relevance for communities that understood the importance of courage, creativity, and cooperation in maintaining the delicate balance between civilization and the wild forces that constantly threatened to overwhelm it. The dressed wolf that stood as a permanent monument to human ingenuity and determination would endure as a testament to the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when confronted with challenges that seemed beyond their capabilities to address or overcome. In transforming their supernatural tormentor into an object of entertainment and instruction, the people of Ansbach had created something far more significant than a mere curiosity or historical artifact. They had demonstrated the fundamental human capacity to impose meaning and control on experiences that might otherwise remain sources of fear, confusion, and social disruption. The legacy of the Beast of Ansbach would continue to inspire and instruct future generations who faced their own struggles against forces that threatened the safety and well-being of their communities. The story would be retold countless times in countless forms, carrying its essential message across barriers of time, language, and culture to remind all who heard it that even the most terrifying manifestations of evil could be defeated through the application of human courage, intelligence, and collective determination. In the end, the Wolf of Ansbach represented more than simply an unusual episode in the history of human-animal conflict, or even a remarkable example of community response to supernatural crisis. It embodied the eternal human struggle to maintain order and meaning in a world where chaos and terror constantly threatened to overwhelm the fragile structures of civilization and community life. The dressed wolf standing in the town square served as a permanent reminder that this struggle could be won, that evil could be defeated, and that ordinary people possess the power to transform even their darkest nightmares into sources of strength, pride, and hope for the future.